Hello and welcome to this Docs42 class. If you don't know Docs42 classes yet, they're short 30-minute tutorials where we introduce you to some new functionalities around Docs42. Today, it's all about the brand new Docs42 Power Automate Premium Connector, and I'm very happy that I have Diego on the call, who has actually developed this connector. Hi, Diego.
Hi, thank you, Lisa, and I'm looking forward to showing you how to set up a flow with our new premium connector.
Yes, thank you, Diego. So basically what we have in plan for today, first I'm going to introduce you to Docs42 and Power Automate. What prerequisites do you need to actually set up your calls? I'm going to show you an example. Then Diego will actually build a flow with you with the Docs42 Premium Connector, and I will give you also a brief introduction into the custom connector if you want to work with that one. And in the end, there will be some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, feel free to just pop them in the chat and we will answer them for you. For now, I'm going to turn my camera off so we will see better everything on the screen. Good. So let's start with the Power Automate connector and what are the prerequisites for actually generating documents in a flow using Docs42. First of all, you need to have a Docs42 server license that can either be Docs42 online or Docs42 on-premise. If you don't have one yet, just feel free to send us a message and we will set up a trial license for you. Then you need at least one Docs42 add-in. This is because you need one template. You need to design it, which you can then later generate with the flow. Then you will need the Docs42 server designer, which really helps you with the setup of your flows. You need a Microsoft Power Automate plan so that you can use our premium connectors, the Docs42 connector, and then you will also need Azure Active Directory for the authentication. And now let's have a look on how those prerequisites and how a flow actually looks like with Docs42. First, I have an example. I'm within SharePoint, and I have here a SharePoint list with employees, and I want to generate a document using the Docs42 connector behind it. I have a trigger set that as soon as I change or adjust one item, what I'm doing now, then Docs42 automatically, so basically a Docs42 Power Automate flow is triggered. It's taking those data sources and it's generating a contract for me and storing it for me on SharePoint. While that is loading and while this is happening in the background, I'm showing you what you need for that flow setup. So basically, as I mentioned before, the new Docs42 connectors, basically within Power Automate, you go to your connectors tab and then you just search for Docs42. And here we have the premium connector. If you open that one, you can see this one here. Of course, this has an extensive documentation as well. So everything you see here today, you can also read afterwards. That's the first thing you need, the Docs42 premium connector. Then what else you need, as I mentioned before, is the Docs42, your Docs42 server or Docs42 online, and you need to register Docs42 online in Azure Active Directory. And basically, these are things which we're going to see later on when Diego sets up this flow. But here we are in our Azure Active Directory Admin Center within the app registrations. I've registered an app called Docs42 Online. I here have my app ID. We will need it for later. I here have my tenant ID, which we will also need. I have here a certificate uploaded, which you could use, and I also have a client secret, which will be needed later on. Those are the prerequisites from Azure Active Directory. And then let's have a look now in the All Contracts library. And basically about a minute ago, the contract for Bodo Botschafter was generated. And here with the adjusted salary, that was done using docs42. And in a query string, we actually said, okay, docs42 premium connector, please generate the document and store it for us on SharePoint. And where we've done that is in the docs42 server designer. If you don't use that yet, we really recommend you to download it. This really easily allows you to set up your calls. And basically, here's an example of a SharePoint action. What you need to do is you need to give your service URL. You need then to tell docs42 what it should do. Should it create a document, store it on SharePoint? Should it send it by email? Should it store it on CRM, for example? Should it store it on an Azure Blob Storage? Whatsoever. In our case, we're having a SharePoint action, and here we said, okay, generate my document and store it on this SharePoint site in this library and with that file name. Of course, I could also pass down some variables here, but I can also give the variables then within the flow. And basically, once I'm satisfied with the setup here, I then go to my REST URL and query strings. And then here I would have the complete REST URL, and here we can see docs42 Power Automate connector parameters. That's exactly the format of the query string I will need in my Power Automate connector to get the flow up and running. And how we're using that and how to set up that flow, Diego is going to show you now.
All right, thanks. Well, first of all, we start off by creating a new automated cloud flow with a SharePoint trigger. You could use any trigger, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to call it demo English and create it. Now, for the authentication, we are going to use the shared secret token flow from Microsoft. And how you set it up, I will show you now. We need to enter the correct site here. And, choose employees and modern employee contract. And first of all, we need to create variables and get secrets from Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault is a service that lets you save certificates, passwords, and so on securely. But you could use any other vault service for this, but Azure Key Vault has a nice premium connector. So first of all, we need two variables, the tenant ID and client ID. So we're going to initialize them. So tenant ID, which is type string, and the value I've got here. I'll just copy this. I also recommend renaming your variables to what they actually are. Just makes things a bit more clear. And if someone else works on the flow or you work on the flow at a later date, let's say, it just makes it easier to understand. Now we need the client ID as well. It's also type string. And Lisa has shown you how to get these. It's just an Azure ID. Copy those values and put them here. Now next up is Azure ID, Azure Key Vault, and we are going to use the get secret action. And I've already established a connection to our Azure Key Vault. You can find how to do this in the documentation, which I highly recommend to download from our website. And first of all, we're going to need the client secret, especially with Azure Key Vault. We want to rename the actions. You will see why. And next up, we've got the username and password. Thanks. And after I've done the last Azure Key Vault secret, I'm going to show you how to set up the most complicated part of this flow, the HTTP connector. and the HTTP post request, you will need to generate an access token. Actually, we're working with ID tokens since we are simulating the Microsoft login pop-up, you might know, in our flow, since our connector has the authentication part outsourced in the flow. All right. So you just type in HTTP, and now we are going to use post here. For the URI, you are going to use the token URI from Microsoft. And now we are actually going to make use of the variables we just set. So I'm going to use tenant here, tenant ID. Then we need to define a special, or rather, just some content type here for Power Automate. Without this, it won't work in Power Automate. But this is all in our documentation, so don't worry about that. Next up, we're going to need the request body, and I've prepared this here. This is also in our documentation. Now the ground type is password. The client ID is our client ID variable. The client secret we are going to get from Azure Key Vault, and now you see why we renamed the actions because you only see value. This is how you get the secrets. Now for scope, you need this exact scope and username. It's not really necessary to save this in the Azure Key Vault, but I just did it for the completeness of the demo. And yeah, this was the most complicated part of the flow. And now we're going to use the premium connector and the service call action. Now, if you do not have a connection yet to the connector, you only really have to define a connection name. And you can leave this empty because our connector just overrides the authorization header. That also means that you do not necessarily need a bearer access token from Azure. You could also have an API key of any other service if you need it. So I'm going to retrieve the parameter values from the Service Designer. This is the same call. And actually, I forgot the one step. This is optional, but again, it's for just to make it more clear. We are going to use a compose. And in here, we are going to create an expression that will give us the ID token, because you're going to get a JSON result. So we are going to go into outputs of the HTTP connector into the body. And here we are going to search for the ID token. And yeah, this we're going to use in as bearer access token. And outputs. And yeah, this is basically it for the setup. I'm going to save this. And now let's test it. Let's go to the SharePoint. Model employee contracts. Go to Max Manager. And let's give him a nice raise. And now the flow should run. All right, let's look at the target library and sort by date. And as you can see, We just created the flow contract a few seconds ago. So yeah, this might look complicated, but it's really just 5 variables and 1 HTTP action, so it's quite simple. And if you want to use a certificate, if you want to do the authentication with an Azure AD application, you can do so by getting a so-called client assertion. And with our new server design version that's coming soon, you can actually generate one of those client assertions. So we're going to go in here, put the tenant and correct client ID. And a certificate you have imported in Azure AD. We're going to use this. And if you click on generate, you get a client assertion. And this you can also save into Azure Key Vault or any other vault service and use it in your flow. Yeah, that's basically it. Back to you, Lisa.
Yes, thank you very much, Diego. So basically what Diego has shown us was how to use the Docs42 Power Automate Premium connector, and there all the authentication was external, so that means that the authentication, the steps you've seen with the variables, with the HTTP call, it happened before calling Docs42. But then there's also another way on how you could use Docs42 from Power Automate, and this is via custom connector. In the custom connector, you set up the authentication within the flow, within the connector. So within the flow, you don't need to add the variables. And one example I wanted to show you now is a Dataverse example. So Diego has shown you an example where the trigger was SharePoint. I now show you an example with Dataverse, where basically you can really use any data source or any trigger with the Docs42 connectors. And here within Dataverse, we are saying, okay, when something is modified in the context table, then the Docs42 service should be called. In that case, we're using the custom connector. You can see the connector itself totally looks the same, just that here the authentication is already happening within, which I will of course show you in a second. Here, the query portion, we're generating a document and sending it by email, and you can see we have a variable here added, like the name here. That would be possible, of course, with the premium connector as well. And how that is working, so I'm going to show you within, I'm actually going to click on test, and I'm going to test it manually. And here within Dataverse, within Dynamics CRM, I can also just, in that scenario, adjust my entry, and whilst they're saved, that the trigger is started, and then Docs42 generates the document and then sends it to me by email. So instead of starting from SharePoint, in that case, we're starting in Dynamics CRM, and we use Dataverse variables and the Dataverse trigger. That was happening here. So that's the service call. I'm just quickly pausing the screen to open my emails to show you that, which will be there in a second. My emails, yes. So now you can see here I've received an email with the contract for Michaela attached, and here the raise to 9,000 euro was done also with our Power Automate connector. And what's the difference here regarding the setup? So here you're really working with Azure Active Directory, and instead of looking for the connectors in the connectors tab, you would go to data and then to custom connectors. And then you would go to new custom connector, and you can go here to import from GitHub. You can look for certified, can be dev or master branch, both will work. And then you search for Docs42. And then you would continue and add the connector. And basically within the connector, this is how it looks like. We would just give the host name, so that's the link to your Docs42 server. And in the security tab, you are providing the authentication to Azure Active Directory. So you can see OAuth 2.0, Azure Active Directory, the client ID you're adding here, the client secret you're adding here, a resource URL, and also the Power Automate redirect URL. That's basically all the information we have here: the app ID, the tenant ID, the client secrets, and in the authentication tab, we also have this redirect URL added. That's what you need to do within the setup. Once that is done, you can use the Docs42 custom connector in that case to set up your flows, and just by adding here the service calls, which you add via which you can retrieve via the server designer from here down below the setup. Yes, and those are the two options on how you can work with Docs42 Power Automate. First of all, the premium connector, the authentication is external, or the custom connector, the authentication happens within the connector. Which one you choose is really up to you. And yeah, if you have questions, feel free to post them now in the chat. We are very happy to answer them. And while you are thinking of questions, feel free to really now test the Docs42 Power Automate Premium Connector. Let us know if you're still missing some licenses. We can always issue them for you. And also check the many resources we have. So you can find the documentation, you can find tutorials, sample templates, a lot of other different videos, all on our resources page. Yes, and also let us know the scenarios where you're using Docs42 and Power Automate. Would be very interesting for us to hear how you're using it. Good, and if you have some questions, feel free to ask them right now. If there are no questions coming in, then you can always just talk to us directly. You can find our email addresses also on the Docs42 website, or just go to the contact form on the Docs42 page, which you can see up here, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. Good, then I think, Diego, that's it.
Yep. Thank you very much, and see you.
Thank you, bye-bye.